I never expected to write a book about evil, and indeed it's always a rather, quite seriously, quite dangerous thing to do. There are safer things to write about. The reason I did was twofold. One, that having written a book about the resurrection, I thought I'd better go back and write some more about the cross to make sure I was being properly balanced with the biblical theology. But as I was thinking that, September the 11th happened, and suddenly all the airwaves were full of evil. Tony Blair astonishingly saying at a party conference that the world was full of evil, and there's evil in the Middle East, and we're going to deal with that. And there's evil in Africa, and we're going to sort that out as well. And George Bush talking about an axis of evil. And it was quite extraordinary. It was as though these men and the systems they represent had really thought that the Enlightenment project was more or less working and that we were ridding the world of evil, and suddenly, blow me, there's some more of it out there. So what are we going to go and do? Well, let's drop some bombs on it and that'll be all right, won't it? And the sheer naivety of that made me then, and makes me now, pretty cross, actually, because it not just because it was a bad thing to do, but because it was philosophically naive to imagine that evil had been somehow sidelined and we had a nice, clean, straightforward world. You could only believe that by, shutting 1.5 eyes and ignoring the cry of the poor and all the rest of it. So I set out to examine the rhetoric of evil in the contemporary world, and then I said to myself, well, as far as I know, the Bible does not tell us where evil came from. So I'm actually not going to try and address that, because it's much more interesting to see the larger thing that the Bible does, which is to say, granted that God's good world has been radically infected by evil, what is God doing about it? Now, at this point, the key move, and here I give full credit to Susan Nyman's book on evil, which I footnote, the key move was to realize that the way we perceive the problem of evil, so-called, in Western culture, is very much a post-Enlightenment thing, particularly following the Lisbon earthquake, All Saints' Day 1755, that up until then it was possible for my distinguished predecessor, Joseph Butler, for instance, to say, and I'm summarizing and rather caricaturing, that if you walk around in your garden and then at night look up and see the stars and observe the moral law within you and all of that stuff, you will eventually deduce that there is a good God and that he has a son called Jesus and that all is basically well. And the Lisbon earthquake comes and says, sorry, just won't do. The world is darker and much more mysterious than that. And so then the world gets split apart and God is upstairs and he doesn't intervene in the world, and religion is about getting in touch with this distant upstairs God, and what happens downstairs is messy, but we'll sort it out by political means if we can. So that then the whole question of salvation is about leaving this world and going to God, and then people read the Bible as though it was simply about how I get saved, not about the mess that the world's in. And I decided instead to try to read the Old Testament and then into the Gospels as the story of how the Creator God is addressing the problem of evil in the world. And when you then read the stories of Abraham, of the Exodus, of whether it's the prophets, Daniel, whatever, all sorts of things make so much sense. And then, and I still remember the excitement and sort of shivers down the spine that I got when I was working through this stuff, reading the Gospels as the books which say, this story of how God is dealing with the problem of evil comes to this climax. That was enormously revealing to me. But then to say that the answer to the problem of evil can never be, now that we've figured out how evil got here in the first place, we can sit back and have done a decent day's work and say there isn't really a problem after all. And I like to tell the story of when I was examining in Oxford once, and I was examining New Testament, my colleague who was examining doctrine put down a question on the paper: would it be immoral to try to solve the problem of evil? And I remember being fascinated by that question and wanting to see what the students would say about it, but realizing that the problem is, if you try and solve the problem of evil as normally presented, you're basically belittling it. And you're saying, oh, well, evil exists because it's the way God is going to make us better in the long run, or something like that. And then you're just not listening to the Holocaust. You're not listening to the tortured child in Dostoevsky, etc., etc. The name of my fellow examiner, by the way, was Rowan Williams, which may not be entirely surprising. It's the sort of question Rowan would ask, and rightly so. And so I then set about, in the second half of the book, trying to say, if that is the solution, how does it apply? because it can't just apply by saying, oh, well, believe in this and you'll go to heaven after all. It must apply through the powerful work of forgiveness and healing in and through the life of the church. And that remains the enormous challenge, as a result of which I've now come to see the philosophical problem of evil as essentially a distraction from the real work which has to be done.
I do think it's quite distinctive of Christianity to talk about God suffering and the atonement and the cross. Those are pretty distinctive. You don't find those in many religious traditions. I don't think you find them in any other religious tradition. So the idea that God suffers has always been very important in Christianity. But again, there have been different ways of interpreting that. And the more traditional way is that God in the divine nature cannot suffer. So God is impassible. God doesn't suffer at all. The reason is, if God is perfect, obviously suffering is not part of perfection, so God can't suffer. So the question is, what happens on the cross? And the traditional view has a very sophisticated way of dealing with that. Jesus' human nature suffers. Jesus is human and divine. So you can say God suffers in the human nature of Jesus. Okay, and that's the tradition. So the divine nature doesn't suffer, the human nature does, but they're united in Jesus, so God suffers in one sense. But many of us have come to feel that that's not adequate, really, to all the suffering in the whole universe, that just the suffering of Jesus' human nature, the suffering of one human person, doesn't cover the vast range of suffering which there is in the universe. And so we feel that the divine suffering which is expressed, manifested on the cross, must involve all suffering. That is, that God in the divine nature suffers. So that's a different interpretation, but it's not changing the fundamental agreed fact that in Christianity God suffers. But it's just saying, well, look, if there's any suffering, and I've suggested, as most theologians do, that suffering is necessary in some way to this universe being what it is and having us in it. Well, if that's true, then any God who was a God of love has to share that suffering, take responsibility for it, really, and reconcile it by entering into it and transforming it. And I think that is the message of the cross, that God enters into that suffering in the divine nature itself, and is able to transform it into something else, into the glory of the resurrection. So that's a fairly new perception, it has to be said. It's radical, that God suffers in the divine nature, but it doesn't betray the tradition. I think it's actually, if I dare say this, more biblical than the traditional views which were more influenced by Greek philosophical ideas of God.
And what happens in the cross and the resurrection, as Moltmann sees it, is that God in Jesus identifies with all the evil and then reverses it in resurrection. So as well as the hope for the future when evil will be overcome, which Moltmann had already done in Theology of Hope, he now injects this very strong emphasis on God in it with us, suffering with us now. So you don't just, as some people critical of Theology of Hope had it, you don't just sit around and wait for the future. The message is not just grit your teeth and bear it. The message is that God is with us in it. And that, I think, is the centre of what he's trying to say in the Crucified God.